My name is Aria Evans. I've been the artistic director intern at Soulpepper Theater for the past year, and I'm also the programmer for our community conversations. We are situated in Dougarondo, which is known as the Gathering Place, on Dish with One Spoon territory. Community conversations would not be possible without the support of TD. TD Ready Commitment has been a huge supporter of Soulpepper's vision towards radical inclusion and make panels like this possible. And our community conversations are happening all season long. The next community conversation is going to be in celebration of Bad Parent. It's happening on September 24th, and it looks at the work-parenting balance that exists in our world, and it's in celebration of Bad Parent by Ins Choi. I'm so happy that you have joined us. And this conversation is called Current Adaptations, and it celebrates Queen, Goneril, and King Lear. You just saw one of those shows. And it's my pleasure to welcome the panelists up to the stage who are going to bring this conversation to life. So we have Yvette Nolan, Ted Witzel, and Erin joining us, and I get to do my favorite thing where I read people's bios out loud to them in front of a room of other people. So come on up here, please, have a seat. So these humans, let me say some words about them. In the center here we have Yvette Nolan, and Yvette has spent 30-odd years in theater as a playwright, director, and dramaturg. Her first Shakespeare was the CBC broadcast of the Stratford Festival production of Julius Caesar. So 40-some-odd years later, she co-created an all-Indigenous Caesar called Death of a Chief that was co-produced by Native Earth and the National Arts Center. In between those two events, she created a 4-person, cross-cultural, gender-bending 20-minute Othello and a 4-person TYA called Shakedown Shakespeare. I want to go back into the decades and watch these, Yvette. Since then, she has translated, so I'm like, what, Henry V? Henry IV? Henry VI? What's IB?
Oh, fourth.
Henry IV, parts 1 and 2.
That's right.
For Play on Shakespeare. And she just directed She-Wolf, the story of Margaret D'Angelo, called from the Henry V's? Sixes off Broadway, honestly. She does Greeks too. Her adaptation of The Birds has had productions at U Regina, York U, CCPA, McGill, U of Alberta, and Interlochen Arts Academy. Not incidentally, she directed Erin Shields' Paradise Lost at CCPA in Victoria in November 2020. I'm so happy you're here. We have Ted Witzel. You ready for this?
Oh, give it to me.
A queer theater maker and arts leader who has worked in theaters across Canada as well as the UK, Italy, and Germany. Ted recently finished up 4 years as artistic associate and laboratory director for the Stratford Festival, where he oversaw the festival's research and development initiatives. As a director, Ted is known for working at the boundary line between new work and classics, often re-envisioning classical texts through a contemporary queer lens. The stranger, the better. Ted's work fuses movement, digital technology, poetry, and image, while borrowing a few tropes from trashy TV to create entirely new performance pieces. Some favorite credits include All's Well That Ends Well in High Park, The Marquise of O at Summerworks, and Lulu, aspects of a femme fatale at Buddy's. Most recently, Ted directed the world premiere of Sunny Drake's latest work, Every Little Nookie, at the Stratford Festival, and it plays till October 1st. Welcome, Ted. And we have Erin Shields. Erin Shields is a Canadian playwright based in Toronto. Much of her work highlights the negation or misrepresentation of women in classical texts by adapting these stories through a feminist lens for a contemporary audience, including Queen Goneril. Her adaptation of Paradise Lost opened at the Stratford Festival of Canada and won the Quebec Writers' Federation Prize for Playwriting. In 2011, Erin won the Governor General's Award for her play, If We Were Birds, which premiered at Tarragon Theatre. Other theatre credits include Piaf Dietrich, Mervish Productions, Seagull Center. You loving this? I'm having a great time. Beautiful Man, Factory Theatre, The Lady from the Sea, the Shaw Festival, the Millennial Malcontent and Soliciting Temptation, Tarragon Theatre, and Instant at Gordy Theatre. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Weyni Mengesha, who is Soulpepper's artistic director, who directed Queen Goneril, who has worked on plays from a classical and contemporary lens at theaters across this nation, who is going to be hosting this conversation. Come on up.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're with us. How many of you have seen King Lear? Oh, good, right. And then some of you have seen Goneril, so we'll have to have a conversation about which order is the best. But thank you so much for joining us on this ride. We're really fortunate to have this panel because these are incredible artists adding incredible new stories to the canon, but also going back and looking at our classical stories and questioning, investigating, and shaking them up to make them to consider for us how they can still resonate to a contemporary audience. So I thank you all for taking the time and being with us to be able to have this conversation, because I think a lot of people are interested in it. A lot of people who love the classical texts and who are artists always talk to us about how they can sort of find themselves in it, make sure that there's a contemporary resonance, and they've all been doing it to great effect. So I want to first start with that question, because you all are people who have expressed your love for the classics, but also like fierce advocators and artists in our contemporary world who have been like fighting to make a platform for new stories and new voices, also to great effect. So why go back to the classics? That's the first question. Let's just start there. Maybe I'll start with you, Erin, since yours is the latest on stage.
Sure. Well, I guess for me, it's that I love them, first of all, is that the classics for me are sort of the foundational building blocks of our modern Western literary tradition. And things like Shakespeare or Milton or Ovid, or Homer, the language, the poetry, the form, the characters, the stories. There's reasons why these things have been around so long, and when you spend time with them, and there's classical texts I don't love, but when you do fall in love with one, you can find new things in it every time. So that's why I go back. Also for me, I think it's important because they are so fundamental as the building blocks of the story of this sort of Western culture that we have. It's important to interrogate why those stories are considered canonical, why they're on the reading lists of every high school and university, and think about what makes them sing, but also what they're missing and what we are missing if those are the only stories that we take as our building blocks.
Amazing. And specifically for this one, the catalyst for this particular play, we came to Erin as someone we really wanted to commission in our new 6-woman writing commission program a couple of years ago. And it started with something missing, a question that you had. She asked us, what if Goneril had a storm? I really want to know what would happen. And then she wrote it. So these incredible questions can lead to these incredible journeys. And so thanks for sharing that. How about you, Yvette?
Yeah, there's a shame involved in loving the classics as an Indigenous artist. Because we have our own stories to tell. But I also think, we do this where we recognize our ancestors who came before us and our descendants who come after, and that we are part of that continuum. And I think if we don't turn around and look back where we came from, we don't know how we can move forward. And so those great stories, and they are great stories, the Greeks, I love the Greeks. Shakespeare, that's the real shameful one for me, especially, God Save the Queen. like, that's the
Too
great
soon.
colonizer, right? And the language. I'm a half-breed. My mother was Algonquin, my father Irish. He was the best Irish speaker in Ireland. My grandfather taught Irish in the hedgerow because it was outlawed. So I'm the descendant of people whose languages were taken from them in favor of English. And that's the only language that I really work in, is English. So there's my Shakespeare shame. And yet, what we all do as theater makers, as playwrights, is we're working, mucking around in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, right? Like, we want to figure out the human experience. And if people have done that before us, often we want to look at why they lasted for 400 years or a couple of thousand.
I feel that in a different way, the shame of confessing that you like these classics for however many problematic intersections we can identify in these stories. And yet it's funny because I was thinking about this. I'm on a big Annie Lennox kick right now. I'm pulling her, I've been listening to Annie Lennox for about a month straight. And funnily enough, we don't feel the same shame about pulling back an earworm from past decades or past centuries, and in the same way that we do with the classics. And yet they're part of that legacy that we live inside of, for better or for worse. And I think that the classics have always been a bit of a guilty pleasure for me, but also a bit of an obsession. Like, so many artists speak about having these kind of singular fixations that eventually you're like, oh, I've been doing the same project for 50 years, just in a different shape. And one of those obsessions for me is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and what those stories actually tell us about ourselves. Like, what do they reveal that we keep telling these stories to ourselves? The same way that artworks can do that, the same way that, like the American Gothic painting, the old dudes in the field with the pitchfork, there is an iconography to that then gets emulated and remixed and reproduced in our culture. So it is about that act of kind of cultural processing or digestion to make sense of the legacies of stories we've inherited.
Right. And I want all of you to be considering what questions you'd like to ask, because we definitely want this to be interactive. So at any time, you just raise your hand. But I do have one more for you, Ted. Just, like I said before, Ted, is at the forefront of conversations about what we're doing in institutions and how we become irrelevant and access and all of those things. But you found yourself at the Stratford Shakespeare Festival for years. I mean, not
because
thinking
the creator has a wicked sense of humor.
Yeah.
They sure do.
Yeah, just as somebody who loves new work, that's an interesting choice. And so how did that help you, and what sort of parameters inspired you when trying to leading new work development through that program?
Sorry, the parameters that inspired me in
yeah,
doing
like I'm
that,
just
or?
wondering about Shakespeare, Stratford Shakespeare Festival.
Oof.
But you are in charge of a laboratory that wants to develop. Sorry. Yeah, in those years, bringing new work. So yeah, why focus on new work at a Stratford Shakespeare Festival, I guess is the question.
Well, it's interesting, and something that really, the year that I started in the role running the lab there, I was at a festival in Berlin where Brendan Jacob Jenkins was speaking, specifically on a panel about canon. And because his work has really engaged with canon and Octoroon, everyone, both of those are adaptations of classic plays, and the moderator asked, what do you think we need to do with the canon? Is it as problematic as we think? And it was really helpful to hear him describe that to his mind, canons are always being reshaped and renegotiated. Every generation is forming the boundaries of what is included or excluded or held up inside of a canon. And that this idea that it's an either or between new work and the canon is maybe a false binary in a way, that there's always some kind of dance with the stories that we've inherited and how we're repurposing them is something that becomes an artifact of our generation. So the new work that we make out of old work becomes a new artifact that will then eventually be the old work that we're reacting against. I'd love to see like the adaptation of Erin's adaptation of Paradise Lost that comes in 20 years or something like that. But this dance with canon is something that we're all going to be doing. And in the work at Stratford and in terms of the commissioning and overseeing development especially, I got really interested in how bringing different processes, different creation processes to a conversation with classics could work. In some of my work in Germany, I was apprenticing with directors who were working on classic plays, but they had sometimes like 9 or 12 weeks of rehearsal, which was enough time to stage the thing, realize what you don't like about it, burn everything you don't like, restage it, and this iterative process end up with a completely new work. There were like, there was one of the shows that I saw while I was there was ostensibly about Moliere, but there was a giant inflatable orca that dominated the stage for a large part of it. I think they said Moliere's name twice, and really it was just its own thing, but it was a conversation with power and irony maybe that captured the spirit of what Moliere was about. And I think that if you offer artists and collectives different ways into interfacing with the classics, you can achieve really surprising results. And that's where I found the most exciting alchemy of being in the lab there, was inviting design-driven approaches or movement-driven approaches, so that the play itself is the text, whether it's Shakespeare or a Greek or whatever, is not the end goal, but rather what those artists create when they gather around that story, or borrow a shape from that story and just create something entirely new, whether it's form, whether it's content, whether it's process.
That's amazing. I mean, I think it's a beautiful way to think about it, you know, and just the idea that we're constantly readapting, you know, and everybody, it's a time old, it's forever. Our ancestors were doing the same thing, and that still, there is this shame because, of course, which stories are actually preserved for us to be able to do that with. We'd probably be doing that with stories from all over the world if it wasn't for, you know, the colonial experience that has happened. So there's something interesting, and also there's obviously lots that were oral tradition, but yeah, those things being cut off, you know, intersect with some of that shame too, because there's something about the missing pieces that are not recognized when we're acknowledging the ones that are preserved. But what do you say to, like, there's a rub there too, right? Like that's bold, and let's not be precious. These were gifts from our ancestors. Let's play with them. But what do you say to those people who feel like actually you are messing with someone's pure form, and there's a reason why they've achieved this longevity because of their beauty and their. So what do you say to those folks who, I'm sure all of you have experienced some pushback in your life about messing with the classics? What do you say to them?
If they were that vulnerable, they wouldn't have survived for 500 years. They can take it.
And those things still exist. Like, Lear will continue to be programmed.
You ruined it.
I ruined it. Yeah,
you destroyed it. It's now just Queen Goneril. There's no King Lear left.
But I mean, is this a real thing? Like, I mean, it is still. Do you think it's still a real thing, or do you think institutions are feeling quite? How do you feel about that realistically?
Realistically, I think out there's a large contingent of people who, or not a large contingent, maybe a vocal contingent of purists who will say that you can do violence on a text. I mean, like, I'm sure it is possible to do violence on a text. I ended up in a conversation about this about 5 years ago, where in a way I felt like the abstraction of this idea of doing violence to a text, I can only make sense of it in legal terms, actually, if there's copyright held, and if the writer still has the rights to the piece, then they can say what happens to the piece. If that person is dead, if that thing is in the public domain, it is material. It is out there. It is there to be worked with. It survived the 75 years after the author's death that it took to become public domain. Pretty sure it's not going anywhere. I really feel like at a certain point, locating a productive friction with a work is incredibly creatively exciting. And artists are going to do that whether you're explicitly taking on a text or implicitly just taking on the stories that we've all grown up with.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it invites, I think, conversation too with the text, and it invites people to revisit the original text, right? Mm-hmm. It's, you know, I hope my version of Paradise Lost inspired people to go and look at the poem, look at the original, and see, you know, be part of that creative process, which is why, you know, the way you've programmed Lear to be with Queen Goneril has been so exciting for me. And I've heard audiences, you know, spying on audiences while watching the shows is that I think it invites audiences on that journey too, to sort of see, okay, well, this is the play that inspired this other play. You get to be, the audience gets to be a part of discovering that conversation and engaging in that conversation.
How many of you are going to see King Lear after seeing Queen Goneril today? Wow, great. Amazing, yeah, it totally is the point. And I mean, I would love to be in the room when somebody made that decision. 75 years was the time. Like, it's an interesting moment, right?
85.
85.
Isn't it different in every
Congress is about to extend the copyright laws to protect Disney's interest in Mickey Mouse, and Canada will do the same under the trade agreements.
Interesting.
It changes from country to country.
Yeah, I thought in Canada it was 50 years, but you know, it's
To protect Mickey Mouse. See, there's all these details. It's really interesting, right? But at some point, we all decided together collectively that at some point a story has survived, as you say. It's fully formed. It's in our imaginations, and actually, it needs the freedom to live in our imaginations a bit. And it's really interesting that as a society we have accepted that, but still at our theaters there's still some discussion about protecting something that, you know, you're saying is durable, doesn't need that protection. I think that's really interesting. Are there any questions from the audience so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wonder, I'm fascinated by the parallels of the play. I'm never going to be able to see production of Lear and witness the binding of that good old man, as they call it, without coming back to Ghana. The other parallel that struck me, though, in the second act is the arrival of Edgar in that character in Lear has a quite different persona to sustain. Were you concerned at all about that difficulty? I mean, was it always intended that Lear and Goneril should be staged as a pair? So in which case, were you concerned that that character, for instance, specifically, would have to remain the same? I can't imagine the foppish Edgar, and my God, he's good. I can't imagine him playing Edgar in that vein in Lear. Was that
Have you seen the Lear yet?
No, I'm waiting to with
anticipation. Yeah, I mean, so my goal was not to create a perfect prequel, to explain, you know, and I think some stories do that successfully, and that's the goal, is to give, like, put all the puzzle pieces together. So it was partly my thought, particularly for the three women, was my central focus, and for Lear to a certain extent. But I was more interested in having a conversation with the play. So there's plot points that happen in my play that also happen in Lear, like the storm, for example. So and for me, that was what was interesting too, is engaging with the form of Lear as much as trying to plot where the characters sort of come to their moments. In terms of Edgar, I mean, I've seen Damien's Edgar, and I mean, it's definitely not exactly like this, but there is a through line for me anyway. I can definitely see it. I've also conveniently left a gap of 7 years. So, anything that I don't quite successfully explain, I'm hoping the audience can be like, oh, well, probably in the 7 years, X, Y, Z happened. But yeah, so to answer your question, I was sort of, partly interested in explaining things, but then also sort of more interested in also thinking about what a new story, and a story about that is also about sort of generational divide, but is very much about this moment I think we find ourselves in, which is I think this sort of youngish generation is really trying to take control and say, no, we need to change the systems. These things aren't working anymore. Let's change these things. And really thinking about the barriers to power that lots of people who have not been able to be center stage in our Shakespeare plays or in leadership positions. What are those barriers to power for those people? And exploring that with my characters.
Thanks for that question. I want to ask another question to the panel, just because I admire these artists so much. It's hard enough to write a play, but then to dance with good old Shakespeare or any of these writers, it's really brave, and it's great because it offers us so much, like you say, a piece, a story that's affected another story, and just I think given you the opportunity to think about any story differently. So we talked about Goneril, Erin's inspiration to write Goneril, and thinking about the storm, and thinking about the 16% of text that's in Lear that's spoken by women, and what would happen if that was flipped. Being that she loved Lear. So I'd love to hear from the two of you what inspired some of the pieces that you took on, the Caesar, for example, or Lulu, or what was the first catalyst?
I'll talk a bit about Death of a Chief, which was Native Earth's adaptation of Julius Caesar, because it came from the community. The artists, the indigenous artists, especially the women, I had just started at Native Earth, this was like 2002-ish, and the women came and said, we don't get Shakespeare auditions. If we get the auditions, we don't have the tools. If we get the roles, we have to play fairies. Or Caliban. And so they were like, we need the text tools. We need because a lot of, especially at that stage, a lot of indigenous actors had not had conservatory training for all the usual reasons. The whole, we're talking about institutional structure, how you get into the conservatory, who gets into the conservatory, what the training is. The training is often, at least when I was younger, tear you down in order to build you up again. Well, we've been torn down plenty, thanks. We don't need to be rebuilt in your image. We're trying to get away from that. So we created an intensive for text and tools, Shakespeare text and tools, with Kathy Kennedy McKinnon, who is the head of coaching at Stratford, who also works in a lot of communities, a lot of multicult theaters, ethnoculturally mandated theater communities. And she did an intensive with a bunch of women, indigenous actors, and they loved it. And I'm like, great, checkbox, did that. And then they came to me and they said, okay, now we need a production because now we have these tools. And I was like, oh, okay. Not thinking like, that I would be developing a Shakespeare play for Native Earth, because we're Canada's oldest Indigenous theater and we have stories to tell. But the artists pushed that. And so we were like, okay, so what play would we be interested in doing? And because Caesar was my first Shakespeare, the Stratford Festival broadcast when I was a toddler, I was like, Caesar. But really, at that point, it made sense to us because it was an easy sort of sidestep to go, oh, this is just like Indigenous band politics, where we choose a leader, we elevate the leader disappoints us, so we tear them down, we choose another leader, we elevate that leader, and that cycle that goes on certainly in some of our communities, probably in some of your communities too. And then we started adapting it in community. So talking about TED form, the form being something that changes the play. We just kept working the text in the room in workshops with different Indigenous actors. And what we ended up with was a Caesar who was played by Monique Mojica, a woman. So we turned it around, became a return to a matriarchal society, but still not, it wasn't like utopian, because we've all been affected by the colonization. So our Caesar is still ambitious. Our Mark Antony was a woman. Our Cassius was a woman. Our Brutus was a man, and Portia was a woman, but we had all of this strength in the Indigenous women now in terms of text work, that's the story we wanted to tell about power and ambition and the community over the individual, which is at its base the Indigenous worldview. It's community over individual. And so Caesar is brought down because they think that Caesar is aspiring to individual over community. I loved the process. It was a 3-year process. We saw a lot of Indigenous actors come through the development of it. And then we co-produced it with the National Arts Centre, and it opened in Ottawa to like 99% houses. And then it came back to Toronto where nobody came. And and we were told, like, people were disappointed that we were speaking the Shakespeare text. People thought that we would be speaking kind of what we call res speak, which is what the Canadian, really CBC has trained the Canadian ear to understand what Indigenous sounds like on the radio, right? And that's interesting because that cadence is often that's about people for whom English is a second language, not, that's someone who speaks Cree first or Anishinaabemowin first, who then speaking in English has that cadence. But that's not who our community was. Our community has been, we're all post-residential school. All of the actors in the room speak English as a first language. But we're fighting those expectations when we started showing it to audiences.
Very interesting. I mean, that's the next thing we should talk about, is that there's also the pushback around form and how and who gets to speak it.
Yeah. Well, and the question of who has access to the classics, or who can find themselves in the classics or whatever canon we've sort of arbitrarily defined. Maybe it's that Harold Bloom book. I hate that book. But I think I started getting really interested in the classics in a similar way. There's a novelist, a trans novelist named Casey Plett, who has this theory of, or has articulated this idea that queer people have to often overread texts. And it's this idea of overreading, where you have to, here's the story, and you read over that story or kind of between the lines in that story to find a queer experience, to find yourself reflected in them. And I think that anyone who comes from some kind of minoritized identity develops an ability to relate to these texts that come from like a fairly heteropatriarchal white supremacist lens, to find themselves in there. If these stories are going to exist, how can I find myself in there? How can I reimagine this story and like take just a couple little clues and invent a little homo in there and like decide I'm gonna follow that storyline. And that is something that I got really accustomed to as a young kid, and I think it just like kind of bled into my practice as an artist. So a lot of my directing work has been about these kind of queer over-readings, but I also got really interested in if I find myself in a text in this way, what if I take some weird, and I like the weirdest, goriest, bloodiest, most perverse of the classics. That's kind of where I'm drawn to, like a good revenge tragedy where 14 people die in the final scene. Love it. And so one that I did recently, Lulu, not so recently, it's been a whole ass pandemic since I did it, but I got really interested. Lulu is this story of this, it's a young femme fatale who might be 18 but also might be 300 years old, who sleeps her way through this series of lovers and husbands sometime in the 1890s or late 1880s, and winds up in the final act working the streets of London in 1888, which is a really bad time to be doing that because there's this guy lurking in the shadows named Jack. And in the final scene of the play, she brings home this man named Jack, and in 10 pages of horrifically violent stage directions, he carves her to pieces on stage. So it's totally up my alley, because it's like, it's got enough like sort of lurid James Bond sex appeal and also just some like horrifying questions about shame, power, sexuality, pleasure, and how all of those manifest. So I became interested because you all kind of cringed when I told you the ending. You hear the story and you just have this reaction, and I got really interested in what it would mean to sort of engage a community in that reaction. And because I was developing it in residence at Buddy's, and one of the things I find most exciting about that theater is that theater's community of audience and how engaged it is. So if I was going to be in residence there, you know, this is no big secret, Buddy's is not like the biggest budget theater in Toronto. So what are the assets that you can mobilize there? It was the community for me. And so again, developing sort of like you're describing, Yvette, I was really interested in what it would mean to take on a process where we kept returning to the text with that community, inviting them to feed into it, inviting a different group of collaborators every time we revisited it. We did it in 7 chapters, and the 7th chapter was like a big-ass production of the play, and then that was the first act, and the second act of it was a kind of deconstruction of the play that was developed basically by spending 5 years with showing people this story, having them go, ooh, and then saying, yeah, but lean into that. Could you tell me more about that? What does that do for you? And like, how does that relate to your practice? So every chapter of that project was based on the kind of last question that was left hanging from the previous iteration. So version 1 was just like, what would it mean to read this play together with a group of writers and have them create their own material? And everybody went, ooh, about the end. So version 2 was, okay, let's dig into this end. What are all the possible meanings? How can we scrape the surface of it? What does this ending mean? Coming out of that, there was a real question about like, what is the male gaze in relationship to this kind of brutal violence? So version 3 was this weird thing we did in an art gallery in Berlin, but version 4 ended up asking that question about like, how does the male gaze play in here? And it ultimately, I turned over directing to my collaborator Susie, and she directed me playing Lulu to say, okay, but what does it mean if you change the body that this is happening to? And we sort of followed that thread of our curiosity, while also every time we made sure we were showing some kind of show to the audience at Buddy's, and then taking their feedback in, taking the questions that were left hanging to make the next step in that piece's journey. And somewhere along the way, we landed on 7 was the right number to end on. I don't know, Susie and I keep threatening to make like Lulu version 83 in 10 years, but I think we've moved on from that one.
Yes. Hi. Our conversation opened today with everyone talking about the honoring and the shame around loving classics. And I think Yvette mentioned that we're part of a continuum, and how do we move forward without looking back? Technically, physically, we could keep moving forward without looking back. So my question to you, all of you, is what does it actually mean to look back? And what would it look like if we did move forward without looking back?
Something about those who don't know their history being forced to repeat it, something like that. I think the reason the stories exist is because there's things to be learned in them. And if we can learn them from 2,000 years down the road or 400 years down the road, if we can go back and muck around in there, then maybe we can move forward. It's not possible as an Indigenous person to move forward without looking back. That's the old, residential school, get over it, it's over. It was over in 1996, and how's that going for us? We have to move forward with our history. And that, I think, includes those guys, Shakespeare and Aristophanes and everybody. But I think if we do it in a way that makes us wiser, in ways that we as artists living in the 21st century can be grappling with the same questions that our forefathers and foremothers and ancestors and grandcestors have been grappling with, then maybe we can actually make change moving forward. I mean, I'm not completely hopeful that we can. We seem to be incapable of making change, but I don't think that we're going to make change by ignoring what went before, because now we're doing that with pandemic, right? Never happened. It's over. Let's move forward. I think we have to keep referring to the ancestors as we move forward.
I think too, for me, a lot of these stories are invisible, and so we have them in us, and we don't have to. We have to look at them. They're just there. I don't remember hearing the story of Adam and Eve for the first time. It feels like just a little fairy tale I've always somehow known, and yet that story has been used to put women down and accuse women of original sin since whenever whoever he was created that story. And so it's in the fabric of many religions. It's in the fabric of our constitutions. It's in the fabric of our laws. They're there, So to me, it's about going, wait, where did that story come from? And let's think about it and talk about it so we can understand its power. Actually, we're not going to stop doing Shakespeare for right now. We're just not. So people have definitely said to me why are you doing a Shakespeare thing? Why don't you invent something new? Well, everything is connected to everything else, and also, to me, Shakespeare is not. He's the most produced playwright probably in the world. So if we don't sort of think about the fact, for me anyway, if we don't think about the fact that he was writing and making shows at a time when women weren't even allowed on stage. It was boys dressed up as women to play these roles, right? And so what's the consequence of that? Well, the consequence is there's 3 women to every 19 men in any given play. So if you just do the play like that and you don't question the gender of the characters, or if you don't think about the race of the actors, you end up with just these weird visions of the world that don't represent who our society. Anyway.
I think there's also something, building on what you both have talked about we need to look back to debunk the smugness of progress that we think we carry. There's something about, everyone sort of hears this idea, you hear the plot of Lulu, you're like, oh, that sounds like an old ass play, but every episode of CSI ends up with a dead sex worker on a table. It starts there, and it's violence as a plot point, and a violence that we just take for granted as a plot point manifests in different places in our storytelling, and we're still under its thrall. And there's something about the act of adaptation that can expose this. It can expose these narrative devices that we take for granted and just allow in a way that asks us to also wrestle, like, inherent in all of this is like most playwriting is somehow about a sense of justice and how we define justice. And so when we have to look at the things that we take for granted, it gives us an opportunity to reshape what justice might actually look like, or to expose the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and what those stories allow us to turn our ignorance towards, to not see and to allow to keep happening. So there is something about intervening in repeated stories that I think is actually very important and very useful and very fruitful and also exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, on a small level, it's been the catalyst for really important conversations in our rehearsal halls, because we've been taking those classical texts, and inherent in them is some explicitly racist notions and language, and it forces us to have those conversations and to sort of recognize more widely that we're preserving not just the language but also ideologies that we're holding on to, and how are we accountable for that? I mean, Shakespeare doesn't have to be accountable for that. We do if we're producing in 2022. So I think it does. It forces us to connect, to reconnect, and to hold ourselves accountable in some way, and to call us all together to just have a little check-in how it's going. You know, I think it's all really incredible points. So it's a great question, and it's like, I think, really a worthy conversation. Yeah.
Motherhood in King Lear, from what I remember, I haven't read it in like a while, is sort of a thing that the play is built around but never really looks at. And obviously, or not obviously, the daughters have no children themselves. And as someone who's writing Queen Goneril about a woman in this play, how did you consider the sort of absence, the conspicuous absence of a queen?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Of, like, how do we consider the conspicuous absence of a queen? It's very true, and I think you'll find in, you know, a lot of Shakespeare plays there's very few mothers actually. So that was something that was really important to me actually when I wanted to start writing, and it actually in some ways kind of crept up on me and became an even bigger part of the story as we went along. Particularly when, you know, Weyni and I started talking about how we wanted to cast this play, and you know, in casting 3 Black women as the sisters, what I think that does for us is we get an image of this mother, in a way that we wouldn't necessarily have an image, such a strong image of this mother had, you know. There's this notion of sort of colorblind casting that tends to be the sort of predominant way that Shakespeare is done now at the festivals and stuff. But that can really like signal to the audience that race isn't important, and then don't worry about it, don't think about it. And that was something that we talked about, that we wanted to, that was important in this story. And particularly with the mother and the sister's sort of connection with her. And we had a lot of good conversations too with the actors when we were rehearsing that, and this sort of feeling of her absence was really important for the daughters and for Lear, I think, as we went to, yeah, as we kept sort of exploring and creating the show together.
We might be. Oh, we have one more question, and that's as much time as we have, so that's perfect.
Okay, real quick. I'm just kind of wondering, like, if potentially you're alive 100 years from now in this sort of situation, how would you describe, as like a society, our relationship to the classics right now?
I'm just going to say that again for the mic. Just if in 100 years, we're looking back at this moment, how would we describe our relationship to the classics right now?
Why are you putting this one on me? It's a really good question. I need to think about that.
Yvette wants to answer it.
Erin doesn't want to answer. No, that's such a good question.
Yeah, I do think, we're at so I'll answer it. I do think we're at a moment where we're really deeply thinking about what it means for something to be a classic. And hearing both of you talk about that and conversations we've had together, Weyni, I think we're, and in you, I think, thinking about, what this theater is and what this theater programs and its relationships to classics. I think we're at a point of questioning, and I think that's a really good place to be at.
And I think in 100 years, I'm hoping that there's a longer line of classics, right? The way that, we're talking now about Shakespeare and the Greeks, but, there's more recent sort of canonical writers like Beckett and Chekhov and like that. So in 100 years, it's like, is Shields part of that lineage, right?
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Like, what are those classics? Yeah. So that, because it has to be a continuum. And, and in 100 years, will Beckett still be there? Right? Will Chekhov still be there? Who have we lost in the interim, but who are we going to gain in the 100? And time is a lot faster now. The time is just so much faster now than it was. Because of technologies, probably, and because the world is ending, probably. Because
don't end it like that.
Well,
Thank you for coming. No, I was kidding.
climate change and, the things that we need to be, which is the other question about what stories we need to tell and how we grapple with the world that we live in now, which is a very different world from even 100 years ago because of the speed that we're going. And so there is a question about, as we go back to Shakespeare and the Greeks and how we make them relevant in this particular world where things are so different.
Yeah, I think connected to that, one of the things that Brendan Jacob Jenkins said on this panel that really stuck with me is that canons are where the wars of self-definition are fought. So for each generation, there is a kind of struggle around identity that happens around what are we collecting as a set of classics. And I think that in the same way that you see this kind of, hopefully, if I allow myself to hope, which I don't always know that I can allow myself to hope, but when I allow myself to hope, I feel like we are teetering at the end of a crumbling supremacy ideology or a crumbling set of supremacy ideologies where there is a demand for the classics that are inside that Harold Bloom book. Harold Bloom is a Yale scholar who has this book called The Western Canon. It's really big and really long, and it's really infuriating. And it's basically some old white dude is like, these are the best things ever written, because I said so. But that collection of stories, I think that canon, that particular set of definitions of the canon, and that particular supremacy ideology that has led to the collation of those works is really under question. And that was some of the most exciting stuff I got to do at Stratford, was to say, let's blow open this idea of canon, let's crop the word Western off the front of it, and let's see, if we are fighting a war of self-definition, who is that we? And when we ask who that we is, then that we has to define what are those stories that made us who we are, or that we trace our lineages through. And we were able to look at some classics from other cultures, other traditions, cultures that have more modern identities but find roots to trace. We looked at how could we build a trans canon when trans identity as we construct it has only existed for however long in modern discourse. And that becomes really exciting to me, because I think that in 100 years from now, when we're looking back at how we relate to the classics, it's as polarizing as every other avenue where we are talking about our identity, because how, like, the classics are where are one place where we find identity. So yes, it's a very polarized moment. It's very fraught. There are people who think that, like, if you throw that Western canon book out the window, you're doing violence on a legacy of literature or a legacy of culture. There's always room for more, though. Like, it's more no one's saying Emily Dickinson was bad. Everyone's just saying yes and. And so, but there is a resistance to what that yes and is, because it's ultimately how we're locating power and how that relates to identity and an idea of lineage. So I think we'll say it was fraught. Because it's a fraught-ass time right now.
I mean, just thinking about the pandemic, that's something Ted and we actually had a little collaboration in both, because Soulpepper was really asking that question about the canon, and we did. It's actually available if you want to listen to it. It's Around the World in 80 Plays, where we went to 8 different countries and looked at what was a significant play to that given country that has also stood the test of time and is considered a historical. Sacred text, or in any way, however you want to describe it, something that's continued to be taught in their schools. And it was so interesting to do that. So I think that comes out of this moment of definition and questioning and questioning the shame of, like, actually maybe we just have to do the work to put those other pieces of our global canon beside our Western canon, so we can try to eradicate that shame and we can feel more empowered and all of that. But it does take a collected effort, which I think is going to come out of this time, where we're going, actually, there is the yes and we're all sort of in charge of that. Especially Toronto, I personally feel that we could be, leaders in this question in the world, just given all the stories that we bring together in this city. So to end on some kind of a brighter note, true. We're having issues with climate, and there is all of the realities have to exist together. But I think there is power to be taken in the fact that Erin Shields can write Queen Goneril. Everyone can sort of say yes and to all of these texts that have inspired them, and we can all find ourselves in these stories ultimately. And thank you all for finding yourselves here with us today. Thank you so much.